I study ableism in sport, and fair warning, there's a lot of it. It is everywhere, and not just in sport, but it is baked into the very fabric that is our society. I've been doing this work for about a decade now, and I've still not found its depths. As a former public school physical educator, I've always had an immense interest in how we move our bodies and how that movement's connection is to our greater well-being. I have ADHD and depression, which is a very interesting combination. I've always felt that moving my body is beneficial to help deal with the daily struggles that I faced. As an educator, I was able to see this benefit replicated in the kids and young adults that I was working with. And it even strengthened my belief in the ability and the importance of moving one's body, feeling good about it, successful, and the connection that had to our overall well-being. Yet, unlike how I was taught, I started to view movement and physical activity differently. I started to recognize that being proficient at a certain motor skill was not the only determinant of being physically active. And physical activity was not the only important aspect of well-being. I started to notice how the systems around us, where we attempted to be physically active, the policies, the structures, the beliefs, they are not set up to support the broad needs of our students, particularly the ones I was working with, especially those with disabilities. My education to that point instilled the importance of a mature form of movement, a corrective form of education that's not too uncommon across most society. Ultimately, my inquisitiveness and the problems my students were facing led me, with the support of my amazing partner, through a PhD at the University of Virginia. During my studies and the time since, I became greatly interested in how the systems we have in place for our health and well-being have failed us. I have learned, both in my academic scholarship as well as within my own personal journey of acceptance with my own disability, just how much the stigma related to disability stifles our ability to support and accommodate those in broader society. I've come to recognize that disability is more than just a set of impairments, that often the greatest limiting factor for any individual is not one's disability, but society's inability to accommodate for them. Many of these barriers and limitations are by design. They're artificially constructed across society. And indeed, as the late Merce Stevens wrote, we live in a disabling society. And that's likely hard for many of you to hear, that we live in a disabling society. But why? Well, we've been taught that disability is taboo, that we shouldn't speak of it, and that if we ignore it, it'll probably just go away. But it's not something that we can easily ignore. Disability impacts over 60 million people in the United States alone. It has been a part of our culture, a part of human nature, since we've called ourselves humans. It's found in every racial or ethnic group, across every individual of every gender, and within every social class. Historically, representations of disability can be found across every society that we have records for, and the stigma relating to that disability can be found for as equally long. In secular cultures, disability is often believed to be a curse or an ill omen. It has roots in our mythologies and our lores, although those are often very negative too. In capitalistic societies such as ours, disability often means the inability to produce, or you can't pull your weight, or more literally, a lack of ability. Very rarely, if ever, is disability viewed synonymously with success or even competence. For most of us, this stigma is taught to us every single day, although we may not always recognize it. It's the shushing of a child for asking about a wheelchair user in front of you in the grocery line. It's the language we use and the expectations that we have created. This stigma is attributable, in many ways, to ableism. And according to an ever-evolving definition by T.L. Lewis, ableism is a set of beliefs and practices that devalue or discriminate against disabled people. Those practices are often rooted very deeply in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and of course, capitalism. It's so insidious, in fact, that you don't even need to be disabled to experience ableism. Take glasses, for instance. Glasses are a widely accepted accommodation for those with visual impairments. Had they not been invented, many people would struggle to engage with many facets of society today. Yet we don't often think of glasses as an accommodation, and those who wear glasses or contacts often don't consider themselves disabled. We have normalized glasses. They're mostly affordable, and they tend to fit in the structures that already exist within our society. Yet, if we have a foggy morning or one loses a contact or breaks their glasses, one quickly remembers how disabling society can be. Similar structures can be seen within other disabled groups, that accommodations are only acceptable if they fit into the existing structures and individuals are deemed pitiable enough to receive them. Nancy Chodorow, in critiquing the laissez-faire cultural response to homophobia in the 1990s, defined such oppressions as permissible prejudices. They are natural within society and they're expected. Consider this room, for example, and the lights that we have. It is a justified cost burden. We know electricity isn't cheap, but the majority of us in here, if not all of us, are sighted. So we don't often consider the cost necessary to light the room, to run the computers that we're using to record it. We don't even, in a room full of hundreds of people, assume that there may be somebody who could benefit from a sign language interpreter or live captions. Now, if somebody needed those accommodations, sure, they could ask for them, but why should they? It's an extra step that somebody with a disability has to take that a non-disabled person does not. Now, among most American universities, the existence of offices of disability services can be viewed as an admission of failure by the university to ensure accessibility is the baseline, not an exception or an afterthought. And I say this not to disparage the work of those in those offices. The work they do is immensely important and invaluable, but it's a Band-Aid. Unless we start with accommodations as a baseline, additional burdens will always be placed on disabled people. Now, sport offers an interesting lens in which to examine disability and thereby broader society. Not infallible itself, sport has rightly been critiqued for its continued reinforcement of gender norms. Yet within sport and recreation, we're allowed to examine the expression of how people move, what makes certain movements or actions wondrous to behold, and we can even understand how interwoven global humanity really is. Disability as well can be a way in which that we can look at how people interact with their own bodies. We can see how their bodies interact with their own identity, and we can problematize the structures in society that are an issue. Yet, even within sport contexts, disability is rarely seen as synonymous with success. Perhaps that is partly due to our apprehension to confront what disability means, because doing so would also involve confronting human fragility. It may also be attributable to the fact that we don't have a great amount of actual representation from those living disabled lives. Now, in trying to understand more deeply about the influences of ableism within sport and society, a colleague of mine and I conducted a thematic metasynthesis, which is the qualitative version of a meta-analysis. We're using first-hand accounts of disabled athletes. We wanted to understand, how did disabled people describe their experiences within sport, what role did it play in their lives, and where did ableism fit in? In our examination, pulling from 31 articles of first-hand accounts, we generated almost 700 individual quotes. Many shorter ones were combined into make bigger quotes ultimately. Through an iterative process, we ultimately defined 3 themes that we felt encompassed how ableism influences the discourse around sport and identity. And now stick with me because they are a bit wordy. In the first one, we see that ableism within sport is rampant and pervasive. Or as we also define this, sometimes you've got to become a second-class citizen. In the second theme, we saw that sport could act as a powerful mediator to ableism in society, yet it was missing justice-oriented approaches. Or we get to take a break from pretending to be normal. And in the last theme, that really looked at how we are missing intersectional examinations of disability within sport, and how certain procedures that we use end up ultimately reinforcing a disability hierarchy. Or, as we said, they simply can't help but being prejudiced. Now, under the first theme, we saw the direct impact of ableism on disabled athletes. Cost, lack of opportunity, plagued most individuals as they sought to be physically active or engage in their communities. Even Paralympians faced hurdles that their Olympic peers did not have to. Now, amongst spaces that were meant to be inclusive and welcoming, those with disabilities, basic access was still lacking. There are so many spaces that are inaccessible. I was constantly showing up to events, and they hadn't been made accessible. For those that acquired disabilities through an accident, they struggled with a loss of dignity and shame about themselves. Social stigmas were omnipresent in the included quotes. Many faced issues such as non-disabled people policing disabled bodies, telling them where they should go or that they weren't disabled enough. It was clear how ignorant non-disabled people were of the disabled peers. Ultimately, in many cases, bullying arose for many of the included participants, even among adults. Dishearteningly, the belief that disability does not equal worthy was scattered across the included studies, including the words that athletes use to describe themselves. A problem is, I don't always feel like my whole person, was a quote that we had from one of our participants. In the second theme, we found sport could inoculate individuals somewhat from the social stigmas surrounding disability. It helped them learn about themselves, what they were capable of, and more importantly, where their new strengths lie. It helped many individuals to find a connection with others within a broader community. Sport helped reduce isolation for them. It also helped some rebel against social norms. I had nothing until I found swimming. I felt like a complete misfit. When I found swimming, that all changed. Ultimately, within sports settings, people could take a break from pretending to be normal. They were able to find acceptance with their disability, and they were able to better understand themselves. Sport, though a potentially powerful force, is not a neutral actor. When represented for the consumption of non-disabled audiences, such as the Paralympics, sport can often reinforce those negative stereotypes and societal stigmas. Often we excuse the accomplishments or successes of disabled athletes as being unexpected. They must be a super crip, that their mobility aid gives them some kind of advantage. In the last theme, my colleague and I recognized the immense failures of the collective group meant to support individuals in their recreational pursuits. Scholars, policymakers, and educators. We failed to adequately make accessibility a baseline among society. In the examined literature, we found great absences of representation. The samples that we saw included were mostly male, mostly white, and overwhelmingly those with physical impairments. Given the location and the type of athletes included, it's also likely that these athletes were more affluent than most of the disabled folks that we would see in broader society. Without intentional thought, the work many of us undertook to help disabled people has only further entrenched ableism and reinforced a hierarchy of disability, where certain disabilities are prioritized and certain accommodations are prioritized over others. Within all the literature that we could find anyway, we were only able to include 31 articles because those were the only ones that had firsthand accounts from disabled athletes. If we are to accept that ableism influences sport in the same ways witnessed in broader society, then we must also accept that we are similarly enamored, that we are products of that same interconnected ableist society. Now, the first step toward equitable change will be to recognize what ableism is for, acknowledge the fallacies that we've told ourselves about disabilities, and reflect on how we too have been complicit. The second step will require a transformative and collective process, one that reimagines our built world so that every person, disabled or not, has the opportunity, the right to try. And that will look radically different from the society we have today. For as long as we continue to situate inclusivity or inclusiveness within oppression, we will never be just or equitable. Sport has only existed in its present context since the turn of the last century. our modern digital society for even less. We made it all up. We have the ability to make it better. We may live in a disabling society, but we don't have to. Thank you.